I'm gonna give a test. Should I turn that up or is that? Can you hear me? I can also speak really, really loudly. I'm getting deaf, so I do it naturally. Test. Should I turn that up or is that? Okay. Can you hear me? I can also turn this down really, really if that would be helpful. I'm getting deaf, so I do it naturally. Should I turn that up or is that? If you're not going to be using it for Zoom or for recording purposes, then maybe it's better just to talk loudly.
Could you try one more time?
Sure, I can. Is that better? The other thing is if you're just doing it for recording, then you can just turn the volume down on the speakers in here, and the Zoom will still get the pickup.
Is there still reverb?
Are you guys hearing reverb? Like, is it echoing a little?
Turn on the speaker. Sure. In the classroom.
Yeah, I think that's the way to go. Doing in the room.
Yes, they should be. I'm not quite sure how to turn off the speakers in here.
If you just turn down the volume,
So
that
this is
should do it.
this is the mic.
The mic.
Big enough.
Oh,
You can go to the system and turn.
maybe on the wall.
But you're not hearing. Yeah, I think it should be okay. Let's try on 30.
Yeah.
Mic test, mic test.
Thanks. All right, guys. Welcome to the seminar. We're very privileged to have Professor William Grimes have talked to us about East Asian financial cooperation. He's one of the most renowned scholars in this field and Japanese political economy. As you guys all know, he was my advisor at Boston University. It was a great privilege to be a student, and honestly, one of the best things to happen to me to be a student. So he's super awesome. It's a rare opportunity to hear from someone like Professor Grimes. So those that are here, real time, very lucky. Please share what you heard to your student, your peers as well. Okay. All right. Let's welcome Professor Grimes.
So I don't know if I'm going to be able to live up to super awesome, but I will at least try to let you leave the room knowing more than you did coming in. So that's the plan for me right now. What I'm going to be talking about is something that is both really big and extremely small. So the really big is the broad title is cooperating in tense times. I don't think I really need to justify this, right? And the small is that we're going to be looking at this issue of East Asian financial cooperation, which is not that widely known, and in some ways seems not to be a very active part of cooperation, but I'll argue it is, and that it's also quite important. So what we're going to do, this is just kind of the overview, is, as I said, we are going to talk about something that's kind of big and small. I'll give an overview of what's going on with the global financial safety net, the way in which the globe is organized to deal with financial crises, and then I'll focus in on the East Asian version of this, which is the Chiang Mai Initiative multilateralization. Big and small. Big is $240 billion committed. This is not a small thing. it could have a really large impact in the event of a new financial crisis. Small in the sense that it's never been used, and there are a lot of questions that remain about it. And also probably, unless you took a class with Professor Lee, probably none of you have heard of it, because it's not something that's really widely known in the literature. It also has one of the worst names of any international organizations I've come across. When you look at this, does it give you any sense at all of what it is? Okay, so again, hopefully you end up learning something. And then I'll be talking about the notion of a regime complex, which is the way in which different pieces of this multi-layered global financial safety net fit together, and talking about the way in which that might lead to greater robustness of the system, but also weaken it. Okay, so what is the global financial safety net? So the global financial safety net is all of the pots of money that can kick in at a time when a country finds itself in a financial crisis, in a currency crisis. We okay still? Okay. So for a long time, the IMF was the only sheriff in town, as we said. So when we talked about the global, the system for managing global financial crises, it was the IMF, full stop. Okay, we talked about the 1980s Latin American debt crisis, IMF, full stop. When we talked about the peso crisis, okay, the IMF, and then some member countries like the United States and some Europeans. It's only with the attack of the Asian financial crisis that really we start seeing a sense that the IMF is not only maybe not your friend, but it's not enough. It's not even enough for the countries that have supported it throughout. So what we've seen is the rise of RFAs, which is regional financial arrangements, which is this thing that we call regional bailout pools, and BSAs, which is bilateral swap agreements, which is just the way in which countries do emergency lending to each other. And this picture, I think, just shows fairly effectively that at this point, the IMF is not the biggest part of the game either. That RFAs exceed the size of the IMF. In the case of Asia, it's fairly likely that money coming from regional sources, whether it is the Chiang Initiative Multilateralization, which is what we call the regional bailout pool here, or just bilateral swap agreements, either pre-existing or created in an emergency, will almost certainly exceed the amount coming from the IMF. So we have a world of multi-layered bailouts, multi-layered insurance funds, if you will. There are enormous disparities among regions. Africa still doesn't have a regional financial arrangement. Latin America has one, but it's really, really, really small. Surprisingly effective, but really, really small. Europe has an enormous one. Asia has a big one. And there are a lot of questions that remain about bilateral swaps, which we can hold off. Okay. This does not move. Okay. All right. So first off, just to get this out of the way, what is Chiang Mai Initiative Multilateralization? So it is an emergency liquidity scheme. It is set up as a swap network. It doesn't have a single pool of funds like the IMF does, or actually the IMF doesn't really lend out of a single pool of funds, but go with it. The Latin American reserve arrangement does have a single pool of funds, and then it lends out of it. In this case, it's actually an agreement by all the countries to lend bilaterally in a specified amount to a country that is declared to be in crisis, with committed funds of up to $240 billion US, as I said. Now, institutionally, there's a couple things that should be noted here. One is that there are different voting shares. These voting shares are based largely on contribution. In other words, this is a creditor-led organization. Japan and China have the largest votes, but neither of them has a large enough vote to be a veto over an agreement to disperse funds, which requires 2/3. A second key institutional characteristic, I should say one other on decision-making, is that all non-dispersal decisions are made by consensus, and all decisions about dispersing funds are made by a supermajority, 2/3 vote of shares. Second is this thing called the IMF link, which means that only up to 40% of funds can be dispersed in the absence of cooperation with the IMF. Okay, so this organization, which was created essentially as an outgrowth of the Asian financial crisis, where there were concerns about the IMF's inability or unwillingness to provide the funds needed in the ways in which the Southeast Asians and Koreans wished that it had been. But in the event of creating this organization, it actually tied directly to the IMF. And this is a way of not having to make difficult choices, essentially. Right? So neither China nor Japan wants to be in the position of saying, okay, Indonesia or Korea or Malaysia, you got yourself into trouble, well, we're not going to bail you out. So instead, they say, we'll bail you out together with the IMF. And so the IMF link ends up being an important trigger, but the IMF link has been decreasing over time. So it started with 90% of funds were linked to the IMF, then 80, then 70, now we're down to 60. On certain facilities, there's a new facility that was created last November, December, that then it can be dispersed without the IMF at all. It's a 50, but it's up to 50%. And then the last point I want to make is that there's been the creation of an organization called the ASEAN+3 Macroeconomic Research Organization, which carries out surveillance and monitoring. So it's trying to keep an eye on what's going on economically, give fair warning to economies that might be heading towards trouble, and then in the event that there actually has to be some sort of bailout, AMRO will be involved. Okay, so first point is, how do you build credibility if the thing's never been used? So Chiang Mai Initiative was first created in May of 2000. Okay, so for those of you who are doing the math here, that's 24 years. 24 years never used. Okay, we've had a few financial crises along the way, right? IMF has been invoked a number of times. We had, I don't know, you guys are younger, but we did have a global financial crisis in 2008. We had a Euro crisis in 2010. We had this thing called COVID, you may remember it, fairly recently. And in a lot of those cases, there was need to bail out economies. Okay. Now, the East Asian economies end up not mostly needing it, but one of the challenges of building credibility, and the most important thing for a bailout agency, is credibility, because if I know that the money will go in the event of a problem, then I won't pull my money out. Right. But if I don't know how it's going to go, then I might be nervous. It's like basically, currency crises are the international equivalent of a bank run. Okay, you're happy to leave your money in the bank, but if I think I may not get all my money, I want to be the first to get it out, so that I'm the one who gets all my money and you're the one who doesn't. Not that I don't want you to get your money out, but I'd rather it be me. Okay, so it's never been used. There's an attempt to try to break the IMF stigma, and the IMF stigma is an important thing. If you talk to politicians or policymakers in most of Southeast Asia or in Korea, they say, we will never borrow from the IMF again. Now, you get different levels of strength of this. Like if you go to Indonesia, it'll like really never again, because we took down an entire government. So there's attempts to try to put in place facilities that are less bothersome to go after. So there's something called the precautionary line. It says we're not really in trouble, but we want to have a little bit of money in advance. There's something called the rapid finance facility, which was just put in place, which is like, oh, we just had a tsunami and we need a bunch of dollars, and we didn't do anything wrong, right? But we had tsunami and now we need the dollars. So doing things that'll try to break this stigma. Hasn't happened yet. Okay. There's also been an attempt to build up a track record by the use of this organization called the AMRO, which carries out surveillance, which oversees cooperation, which does technical assistance, and that carries out test runs with the IMF and the member countries to try to model the way that an actual bailout would work. Right? How would we do it? How would we cooperate with the IMF? How would we structure the conditionality on this thing? And to make sure that the money would actually move, because the money is not sitting in a fund, remember. It's China's got money and Japan's got money and Korea's got money, and they're all agreeing to provide dollars in the event. But the mechanism by which this thing is done needs to be put in place in advance. And so there's been a capacity building, call it, to try to build a track record. In this regard, so we have quite a bit of movement towards greater consistency, more capacity. Again, this is largely happening in the surveillance organization, which is not the organization that makes the decision about whether to disperse money. There is no organization that makes a decision about when to disperse money. There's an ad hoc meeting of the ASEAN+3 finance ministers that would make that decision. Okay, so the process is somewhat separated, but there's no place else really. Should I be admitting all the people who show up on this, by the way? I just noticed somebody showed up. I admitted her, whoever she was. Okay, so the other ways of, so one of the key questions for this organization, for this regime, is how do you build, how do you increase the trust that it will be there when you want it to be there and will operate the way you want it to operate? So we have the rise in institutionalization. There's efforts to create clearer senses of autonomy and accountability. We can talk about the specifics of this more later if you would like. And very importantly, they've developed this relationship with the IMF. So there's a cooperative relationship. They've been doing capacity building. They do the test runs, et cetera. Okay, so that's the basic picture of what we're talking about in East Asia. So this has been identified by a few people as a regime complex. And so what we did, this is based on a paper that I published together with Ye Chan and another co-author in the International Relations of the Asia Pacific, January of this year. And so this has been identified as a regime complex. And the question really is, so what? Okay, so I don't know if you guys have come across this notion of regime complexes before. Okay, I'm not a huge fan of political science jargon, but sometimes it's useful. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time trying to justify that, like, I made a definition and this thing fits the definition. Not a useful exercise. But I think that it raises questions about where to look to see whether this is how these things operate in, again, times that are tense among the countries. So regime complex has been defined in a couple of ways. I'm going to basically go with the second of these, so it doesn't have to be. So you have several regimes that are on a common subject matter. They have overlapping membership. Yes. Okay, so here we have the IMF has global membership. The RFA, the ASEAN+3, is that group, and then you also have a series of bilaterals, and that the interactions may be problematic. They may, in other words, not naturally be consistent. So, in international relations, we come across a lot of things that are that seem like this. There are some things that are self-reinforcing. There's some forms of cooperation that are self-reinforcing. For example, When I'm in Japan, I look right before I cross the street and then left. In the United States, I look left and then right. Just as if you're driving, it's self-reinforcing that you're gonna stay on the left, right? Because if you don't, you'll be punished pretty quickly. That's not the way that most things, and nobody cares if you're left or right, you just wanna all be on the same side of the road. But this is one of these places in which there might be different standards and different preferences for wanting to release the funds. And so therefore you have this interesting regime complex. It is multi-layered, and it has politics in the middle of it. Okay, so and the politics of bilateral swaps are rather important. Before I go into that, though, let me just make one other really quick point, which is that nobody wants to use this, right? And the evidence that we have that nobody wants to use this is that that all of the countries of Southeast of the ASEAN+3 are holding large amounts of reserves. You hold reserves if you don't want to ask somebody else for money, right? And it's an expensive form of insurance policy. These are countries that have potential for rapid growth, and instead of using your potential for rapid growth, you're putting your money, you're putting tens, hundreds, depending on the country, thousands of billions of dollars into low yielding US treasuries, right? And so there might be better uses for this money than just funding my mortgage. Thank you, by the way, I have a very low interest rate on my mortgage, thanks to the rest of the world being willing to do this. But it shows that they don't want to have to rely on regional solutions or bilateral solutions. I should say, this is one of these things that makes immediate sense to me because I've been studying it a long time ago, but may not be immediately apparent, is that when the Chiang Mai Initiative was first put in place, one of the justifications was that by having a regional fund, then each of the countries in Southeast Asia would not have to hold this big chunk of dollars that's not performing at all, right? The idea was you can hold less dollars and then you can focus on development and things that actually matter to you. And the fact that that has not panned out, and in fact, reserves have only grown over time, either both nominally, as an amount, but also as a percentage of GDP, should tell us that that there's something else going on. Okay. Now, so what does the regime complex look like in practice? So let's just grab an example. These are figures from a couple months ago, but they're basically right. Okay. So what would happen if South Korea got into trouble? South Korea faced some sort of payments difficulty. Okay. You start with your foreign exchange reserves, $415 billion. That is not a small amount of money, by the way. You can see that that the number keeps going up. You would have access to IMF funds if you had to. Don't know exactly how much, right? But if we look at the fund at the facility that they'd be most likely to use, which is the extended fund facility, that's up to $51 billion. Chiang Mai funds, that we actually can give you an actual answer to, 38.4 billion. And then you have a series of possible swap agreements. And the only one of which is permanent is the China one. Korea used to have a permanent one with Japan, but it dropped it a number of years ago. When? 2010? It had some sort of territorial dispute. And then you have these temporary Fed swaps. Now, what would Korea actually do if it found itself facing a significant outflow of currency? Like, do you go for all of them at once? Do you sort of do you go in order? Like what's the order? Anybody have a preference order for what you would choose? What? Yeah, reserves go first for sure. But and you only go ask for help if you think your reserves are going to be insufficient. Okay. Yes, reserves first. Then what? What comes after reserves? Nobody wants to hazard a guess. Okay, I'll tell you what comes after reserves because we know the answer. The next thing you do is you go to the Fed and you ask for a bilateral swap. You don't have one, but you ask for one. And the Fed has put in place bilateral swaps in two times for Korea during crises. Again, 2008, global financial crisis, 2020, the COVID crisis, and those are the funds that Korea has actually drawn on. Okay. And the reason there's a number of reasons for preferring to go through the U.S. Fed if they'll give you a swap, right? One, it prints dollars. Okay, like if you need dollars, and this is all about needing dollars, why not go to the source? Nothing is more credible than getting dollars from the Fed. I mean, I don't even have to wait for the bilateral swap to happen. Like dollars, Fed says yes. Okay, we're set. Second, Fed swaps don't come with conditions. Nice, right? That beats getting money from the IMF. IMF money comes with conditions. It comes in tranches. You have a lot of IMF stigma, right? So nobody wants to go to the IMF if they can avoid it. Chiang Mai, okay, Chiang Mai is fine. We don't know if it'll work. Not 100%. I say it will, but who knows? And plus, it's tied to the IMF. Okay, so that's maybe not that attractive. And then you've got this China local currency swap, LCY's local currency. Okay, this is not that attractive because it's not dollars, right? So unless you have some further agreement that you can swap out the dollars, the yuan for dollars, then okay. So what we have then is sort of a preference ordering of how countries would prefer the world to work. And this is the Korean one is actually easy because Korea will have access to U.S. Federal Reserve swap, assuming that they haven't done something really crazy, because Korea is important enough to the global financial system that the Fed has twice in the past issued swap agreements, and Korea's drawn on. Okay, that's easy. Indonesia. Okay, Indonesia I picked Indonesia basically because it's not Korea, and I can give you pretty large numbers on it. Indonesia has substantial foreign exchange reserves. And you can see they rose substantially for a while, and then they kind of skitter around after 2011 or so. Whoops. You can have access to IMF funds. You actually get probably higher access to money through Chiang Mai. You have a U.S. Japan bilateral swap that is further tied to Chiang Mai initiative. Okay, and then you have these local currency swaps with China and Korea. This is a much more complicated game. Because, okay, again, you all start with foreign exchange reserves, but $144 billion, you can run through that pretty quickly, particularly if you're in a commodities down cycle where Indonesia, which is a commodities exporters, might find itself to be draining currency, might be draining dollars. Okay, this is all a story of dollars. So at this point, given the IMF stigma, what Indonesia would prefer is not to go to the IMF. Indonesia would prefer to go access those Chiang Mai funds, access bilaterals, okay? But they only can access the bulk of the Chiang Mai funds if they go to the IMF. Okay, so but what if they just go to Japan? Japan's got this thing, right? So, well, Japan has said, well, this is tied to the Chiang Mai, right? And they've made you can see this, the amount is the same as the total access to Chiang Mai funds. And essentially they've said that we'll match it. So now if you're only getting 40% of the Chiang Mai funds, that's about $10 billion, and you get another 10 billion off of Japan. That's not going to be enough to save anything. Okay, so the question is, at what point do countries does Indonesia go and just go to Japan and say, look, we are not going to go to the IMF, but you know we're good for it. Release the money, right? I'm not saying that it'll happen, right? I'm just saying that it raises questions. Going to China, going to Korea is not a problem, but in all of these cases, it's essentially to keep trade going. Okay, I already pointed that out. All right, so this is the point I just made. Okay, so the question as we think about Chiang Mai Initiative Multilateralization, CMIM, is, okay, you don't go to the trouble of building up a pool of funds of $240 billion in order never to use it, right? Or at least you want it to be a credible line of defense so that you don't get speculative attacks. So the key question then, in order to make this regime complex work effectively, is how can we make the Chiang Mai Initiative useful, and what would this look like? So we'll get to this in a moment. But this is where I want to get back to the title of the talk, which is cooperating in intense times, which is that fundamentally the challenges of regional financial cooperation are not economic ones, they're political ones, right? And not like politics bad, politics good, but politics as in, sorry, there's another person I need to admit here. Politics is in this, the regime complexes only work as expected if everybody does what's expected, right? For Chiang Mai money to be released, you need to get a 2/3 vote. That's actually probably not that hard. You need to have an agreement, you need to have a willingness on the part of the leading countries in Chiang Mai, Japan and China, Korea, that they have, that they will operate together and based on the economic needs of the country, and not based on their own political aspirations relative to each other. Okay, so this is what makes this particular regime complex so interesting, is that there are these very, very basic political problems at the base. One of them is Japan and China. So Japan and China have, in terms of financial stability in East Asia, they share economic interests. It's very difficult to see any daylight at all between the interests of China in maintaining financial stability in Indonesia and Korea and those of Japan. There's really no difference. They're both highly exposed. They're both the major economies. They're both going to get sucked into any bailout that happens. They have identical economic interests. They may not have identical political interests, right? In two ways. One is there may be situations in which one or the other country doesn't want to participate in a bailout or does want to have a bailout to a country that is, say, a client state. Let me give you an example. So if you were to ask Dean Sato about what's been going on in the South China Sea, he might say something about Chinese and Philippine boats encountering each other in various ways. And he might point out that a number of Philippine sailors were actually fairly badly injured by a relatively recent incident. So I don't know if Philippines were to find itself in a currency crisis, would China find that to be a good time, potentially, to put pressure on the Philippines by not bailing it out? It's possible, right? I'm not saying it will happen. I'm just saying it's possible. There's also the possibility of political mistrust of whether you want to support a client state or not. I'm not going to have this all on China, but neither Japan nor China can really trust that the other country will do what they want it to do in a crisis. And so both countries made the wise decision to try to put in a series of mechanisms to reduce choice, right? In game theory, like talk about tying yourself to the mast, or exchange of hostile, whatever you want to call these things. So, for example, linking it to the IMF reduces reduces discretion. Giving neither country enough votes to have veto power reduces the discretion to do these. But are those? We don't know if those institutional moves will be enough. The other part of the politics is the politics of creditors versus borrowers. So when the Asian financial crisis first hit, there was discussion, there was a proposal to create an Asian monetary fund. The Asian monetary fund was roughly $100 billion, will provide money quickly and without conditions, okay? And this is exactly what you want to do in a crisis. It's exactly what you don't want to do if you don't want to create the next crisis. So the concerns about moral hazard come in the sense that, well, if I guarantee that I'm going to bail you out, will you act less responsibly, right? Will you hold less reserves? Will you take bigger chances in macroeconomic policy? Will you spend money you don't have right before an election? Stranger things have happened, right? In fact, that's exactly the story of how the Latin American crisis started. Had to do with Mexican spending right before the presidential election. And so the other part of the inescapable politics is the politics of creditors versus borrowers. The reason why the Chiang Mai initiative is driven by the creditor logic of Japan and China, which is that they don't want to ever have to use this thing. And if they do, they want it to be for really good reason. This is not, by the way, the only way that you could set up a regional financial arrangement. I'll give you an example. The Latin American Reserve Agreement, the FLAR, has absolutely equal voting, no matter how much money you put in. Now, the differences aren't huge, right? So some put in, was it 1 billion, and some put in 2. It's like a factor of 2 is the number. Whereas in the case of Chiang Mai initiative, you have China and Japan are pledging $77 billion, and Brunei is pledging $60 million. Okay, so the scale is quite a bit larger, but it is possible to have a more equal distribution of votes, but they chose not to. This remains primarily a creditor-based organization, and that layers with another creditor-based organization, which is the IMF, and the bilateral swap agreements are nothing other than a creditor-based arrangement, right? I will lend you money if I say that I'll lend you money. There's nothing beyond that, okay? And so one of the things that we have that we need to remember is that there is this basic tension in the regional financial arrangement that makes it less useful, because as long as it's tied to the IMF, you still have the IMF stigma problem. And essentially, the problem of the layering of the regime complex is where we come down here is what I'm calling the politics of discretion, which is that borrowers are going to want to be able to venue shop. They're going to want to be able to go to the place where they're most likely to get the money at the lowest possible conditionality. Totally reasonably, right? We all prefer this. For the creditors, it's better not to be picked off one by one because then you're more likely to make political decisions. And then the ways in which in which different countries have responded to this, which I think is kind of interesting, is that China and Japan have chosen fundamentally different strategies. Japan has chosen to delegate, right? So we look at this one. Japan has a dollar swap of $22.76 billion with Indonesia. It has a similar one with the Philippines, a little bit smaller. What is it, 12 billion? I'm not sure exactly right now. But they have made it really clear that they consider this to be tied to Chiang Mai, right? Whereas the Chinese swaps are not tied to anything, except do you need Chinese renminbi and am I willing to give it to you? So China's approach has been discretion, has been to leave open the opportunity to use bilateral power in a way that Japan has consciously avoided being put in the situation of having to make a choice. And that has something to do with the way that these countries operate. Okay, so that's it. That is the challenges of cooperation in tough times. I want to say, I think that if you actually have a financial crisis, this thing will work. Nobody wants to find out. And the fact that it remains uncertain 24 years after it was created, after multiple rounds of reinforcement, reinstitutionalization, testing, creating institutional memory, should make us all a little bit nervous. Okay, so that's where I end. Thank you.
Q&A session. And if you guys have any questions for Professor Grimes, please feel free to ask.
Thank you very much, Professor. My name is Eyal, and I'm also Professor Lee's student. So I have, you mentioned that maybe the link to the IMF can be reduced and it might increase the credibility, right? Or am I wrong? Okay.
That's an option. That's one of the ways.
It's an option, right?
Yeah.
I was wondering if US has a certain interest in keeping the Chiang Mai initiative linked to the IMF. I was thinking that once it departs too much from the current liberal international order that is centered on the West, would that reduce potentially the political power?
Yeah, so when the Asian Monetary Fund was first proposed in 1997, there was a lot of pushback from the United States and from the IMF. And a lot of people in East Asia thought that had something to do with the fact that the US didn't want to be cut out of the telling people what to do game. Over time, the US has had no objections to Chiang Mai. And has not had, literally, there's no direct involvement. That doesn't mean that you're not right. Okay, I'm just saying that at the moment, it's not clear that would be the case. So the biggest opponent of changing, of reducing the IMF link. Okay, question. Who do we think has been the biggest opponent of reducing the IMF link? We'll go through the easy ones first. Southeast Asian countries. Do they oppose the IMF? Do they want to have less or more IMF? Less IMF. Okay. They've been saying get rid of the IMF from the beginning. All right. Korea. What do we think? Less IMF? Less IMF, right? Okay. Now we get to the actual ones that matter. because these are the two countries that would actually be creditors, that are under any reasonable assumption, they would be creditors in any sort of thing. So that's Japan and China. So which country do you think has been most in opposition to reducing the IMF link of these two? China. China. And why? This is actually not a trick question. And it's a surprisingly simple answer. It's because China doesn't want to lose money. So China has been much more conservative about its willingness to put money at risk, put dollars at risk through Chiang Mai or other arrangements than other countries. So Japan's kind of wavered a little bit. There's been just some discussion about, like, you know, only IMF link if it's an actual crisis. If you're going to do the precautionary line, possibly, you know, reduce it further or maybe to zero. So there's been a little bit of ambiguity in the Japanese position. It's largely driven by an economic analysis of what would be used more. But the Chinese have been very, very reticent about it. And frankly, I think they're doing Japan a little bit of a favor on this one, because creditors, right? Japan and China are more or less guaranteed to be creditors, and they don't want to put their money at risk. So if you make it more difficult to get access to the money, and you add the IMF, which adds all these conditions, then you know, then that sounds kind of awesome. So you know, there's an argument to be made in the direction that you're talking about, but as it turns out, the consistent vote against increasing the IMF link has been China, and it's not because China's evil. You can think of China what you want, but it's because China is very conservative about not wanting to lose its money in cases of lending into these things. Yeah. Yeah. All right.
Thank you for the presentation, Professor Grimes. I think a natural question would be, what would the Chiang Mai Initiative fund disbursement look like if there is a crisis? Since you mentioned that if there's a crisis, this will work.
Yeah.
How would it look like?
Okay. So this one I can actually answer, and I can answer with some level of specificity. So this thing is set up as a series of bilateral swaps. So if we want to look at this, okay. So Indonesia, for example, is putting in, is committed $9.1 billion. It has what's called a purchasing multiple of 2.5, which means that it's able to draw up to 2.5 times its contribution, which is our $22.76 billion. Okay. Now, let's say if it's drawing $22.76 billion, and you look at all of the contributions, the shares in here. So subtract out Indonesia, and everybody else has to kick in money that's proportionate to its share. Okay, so if we take out Indonesia, which is about 4%, then you know, China's contribution should be 32%. It's going to be a little bit less than that. It's going to be, you know, 31.5% or something like that. I'm not doing the math in my head right now. And Japan will do that. Okay, so then we have, so there will be a vote, and they'll agree to disperse a certain amount. It'll be done in proportion to the shares. And the way that the money is actually transferred is through a central bank bilateral swap. And the way that actually works is that, are we going to do this with Indonesia? We'll do it with Indonesia, just because it's alphabetically first among the Southeast Asians. Okay, this is not among the big Southeast Asians. I'm not making any predictions. So Indonesia will put, what do we say? $6.5 billion worth of rupiah into an account in its central bank under the name China, and the same for Japan, and then proportion it down. And then the Indonesia, these countries will provide dollars to Indonesia through its account at the New York Federal Reserve Bank. So they will then say, okay, we're going to transfer $6.5 billion, China and Japan, of our account at the Federal Reserve in New York, and we're going to provide that to Indonesia to do with whatever it feels. So that's exactly how it works. Before that happens, though, conditions have to be created, right? So the IMF will go in and they'll do their analysis and they'll say what they think. And AMRO, which is the ASEAN+3 organization, will do a parallel thing, probably in cooperation, because they're all using similar data. And they'll come up with ideas about how much money is needed, how much of that is going to come from IMF, how much of it is going to come from Chiang Mai, and what the conditions will look like. So presumably, the larger the amount of money, the more conditions there will be, and the larger proportion of money will come from the IMF. And then they'll monitor. So if you want to be slightly, to complicate it a little bit more, the element of risk for each of our ASEAN+3 countries who are all making this trade, this swap bilaterally, is that that Chiang Mai lending is not as senior as IMF lending. IMF lending is senior to all other money. IMF gets paid before anybody else does. That's the rule of the IMF. Chiang Mai is not the IMF. So they'll be somewhere else in that cascade if there ends up being actual default. But nobody really expects there will be an actual default. Because honestly, what will happen? China and Japan will provide aid. Right? Well, let me put this one other way, which is if there's a financial crisis, there's no way that China and Japan aren't involved. So this is, I kind of like to think of it as a prepackaged bankruptcy. It just means you don't have to go and like renegotiate who's going to do what in the event of a crisis, as we've seen happen elsewhere. Like the Asian financial crisis, right? The IMF didn't have enough money and they ended up having these very, very complicated bailouts that involved IMF, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, Japan, United States, China, Singapore, several European countries, you name it, right? And then they had like first tranche and second tranche. It's really, really complicated. But imagine negotiating that at the same time that you're negotiating your Korea, right? And they're negotiating a $57 billion package with a dozen international actors. And meanwhile, they're trying to negotiate with the banks. Like it's a disaster, right? So what Chiang Mai Initiative does is it everybody knows what they're supposed to do. We can't guarantee they will, but we can guarantee at least they know what they're supposed to do, and it raises the likelihood. And there's a lot of reputational reasons why they will. Dean Sato.
Thank you very much. Yes, it's a very interesting case of a regional cooperation. And what it comes to my mind is that as a non-Western, or maybe just say Asian-centered cooperation, for the trade front, Japan, China, and ASEAN countries were working for the RCEP agreement, and the India bailed out in the last minutes. And that's because of India's difficulty with liberalizing certain trade sectors. On the other hand, in terms of finance, I don't see an obstacle India not trying to join Chiang Mai Initiative or something regional like this. So I was wondering what might be the prospect of India to join this and what kind of obstacles you may anticipate.
So far, there's been no such discussion to the best of my knowledge, except among people like, academics, right? And so I want to be a little bit careful with this. So there are a lot of regional organizations that that expand in various ways. They can expand the region, like like ASEAN is soon going to go to 11 countries because East Timor is sooner or later going to be, I think, don't quote me, but I believe that East Timor will become the 11th ASEAN country. Okay, so the notion of the region can change over time. The regional organizations can also expand extra regionally. So Asian Development Bank, one of the two biggest sponsors is the United States, right? Germany is up there. So there's been some discussion about whether it would be beneficial to bring in other potential contributors, which could theoretically include Australia, New Zealand, United States, Canada, India. I think probably not Russia right now. I think we have a reasonable bet that Russia's not in the game. But okay, so India could come in either as a notion of an expanded region or as kind of a extra firepower. So I think the answer is no. By the way, I'm going to give a long answer, but my answer is I don't see any prospects of India joining us. So I'll give you three reasons why. Reason number one is, and I'll end with the most obvious, but reason number one is that Southeast Asian countries don't necessarily think of India as a member of the region, particularly as a member of the economic region. If we think about Chiang Mai Initiative multilateralization being about the common good of financial stability, there's very little ability of a financial crisis to reverberate outside of India through Southeast Asia or the other way around. And so as opposed to, we saw this happen before. First you get Thailand, then you get Indonesia. Philippines would have been in crisis in 1997, except it was already under an IMF plan. Then you go to Korea, right? And everybody throughout Southeast Asia is hit, and in Northeast Asia, but India is not touched. So one is they would have, so I think that particular route, the notion of India as a member of the region for financial purposes, I'm not sure that anybody buys that at the moment. And these things have to operate in consensus. So ASEAN would have to make that decision more than anything. Okay. Two is the other possibility is that India brings something that is really valuable, which is why you invite outsiders, right? In other words, they bring money. Well, but India might actually need this money. So now you're bringing in like a potentially really big borrower and maybe not a very generous lender. Okay, so that probably doesn't work. And then the third one is the obvious one, which is, I don't know, we hear that there's China-India tensions. And so this may not be the moment for a greater embrace. And so things like RCEP are made more possible because it was ASEAN leadership and also because it's trade, and trade is a series of negotiations. Yeah, so that, no, is the short answer again.
Thank you so much. My question is that so we have this Chiang Mai initiative. In a case of like a crisis, because we all already know that China is also very known to be investing money as well as like bailing out countries like Sri Lanka. Not bailing out, at least trying to bail out these countries. If a country, especially within this Chiang Mai initiative, goes into like bankruptcy or something like that, would it be more desirable for them to go through the Chiang Mai initiative or just straightly have like a bilateral bailout with China's aid? Thank you.
So let me slightly flip that, if I may, which is that to the extent that that there's more Chinese investment and lending to countries that are part of the ASEAN+3, the more attractive it is to China that the Chiang Mai initiative work. So the one of the reasons, so if you think back to the reason why, like, why is this the region? Why did Japan and China feel like they have to be involved in this? The reason is they were already involved in it, right? So for Japan especially, it was, you know, the biggest investor in Thailand and a number of other countries. It was a major aid donor. It was doing a fair amount of lending into Southeast Asia and certainly Korea. And so it was very badly affected by the financial instability that resulted. So to the extent that the countries within this group become more dependent on Chinese lending in one way or another, the more that China is going to want to help them out of a crisis. And so that strengthens the functional argument for it. I think that kind of touches on the first part of what you're saying. So the second question is you brought up Sri Lanka and the possibility, okay, now we potentially have, you know, China's got an interest in bailing out itself. So as far as I know, there's one example. I'm not extremely well versed in it, but I'll tell you anyway. And just don't quote me if I get it wrong. So this is Mongolia, and I think the year is 2017 or 18. So Mongolia starts running low on dollar reserves, and China, of course, is a big investor and lender to Mongolia, and has a bilateral swap agreement with Mongolia. And essentially, Mongolia is in need of dollars, doesn't have dollars. China doesn't want to disrupt the trade, so it you know, opens the spigots on the bilateral swap agreement. But that operates essentially as a bridge to Mongolia going to the IMF and getting an agreement. So you can, again, this is one of these things where depending on which direction you can look at, you can say either China really helped Mongolia by providing this bridge in the form of a local currency swap line, or you know, IMF bailed out China. So you can go both ways, right? Depending on which what your priors are. You know, probably both, a little bit of both, arguably. But so that's kind of the logic that I would suggest is that that higher levels of Chinese lending will lead to greater willingness of China to lend other people's money to the problem. That's what these IMF multilateral loans are, right? It's lending it's not just lending my money, it's lending other people's money. And of course its own, right? But so the multilateral money of various levels, in which China has high levels of voice in both IMF and Chiang Mai, obviously not in the Japan dollar swap networks, would all operate in the same direction and towards trying to make this thing work better. And you know, whether we'll see what happens, but the Belt and Road Initiative is not a reason not to. It would not be a reason to move away from this. It would be a reason to reinforce it. Yeah.
Not really so learned in the field, but I couldn't help but ask this question about Singapore's position in the CMIM. Since it is Chiang Mai, the initiative multilateralization, I was wondering what Singapore intends to earn in the long run through this organization, because to me, it kind of feels like they're like the hands pulling the strings, the small one in a sense. It's just kind of like an impression. So I was wondering what Singapore has in this game.
So Singapore is deeply interdependent with its Southeast Asian neighbors. That's what it has in the game. so Singapore's, well-managed economy. They've got foreign exchange reserves that exceed GDP. Last time I checked, it was like the numbers are a little funky because they're including some of their sovereign wealth funds, but nonetheless, they got lots of external assets. The last time we had an actual financial crisis, the Fed extended Singapore access to bilateral swap agreement because Singapore is integral to the global economy. Okay, so I think Singapore ends up being fine on this, but their interest really is in A, financial stability, and B, ASEAN solidarity. I'll say one other thing about Singapore and this is that the AMRO is actually located in Singapore in the 6th or 7th floor of the Monetary Authority of Singapore building. That's just because, it's a good location for it. Singapore donated this to donated the space and IT help and et cetera. But I think Singapore's interest is in having financial stability throughout the region, and so anything that reinforces it is a good thing. What Singapore isn't is a player in the regime complex, right? If you look at this, it has its votes is about 10% of the. Is that right? No, excuse me. Votes are about 4%, 4.5% of the total votes. It doesn't have the swing hand in anything, but ASEAN solidarity tends to hold, and so that's both a force multiplier for Singapore, but they also have to obey if they're on the other end of that.
Thank you.
So I wanted to ask, since currently in the CMIM, there's still a particular legacy, right, from the IMF conditionalities, right? And I feel like that's what they're kind of like trying to do, what the CMIM trying to do. They're kind of like trying to de-link themselves from the IMF conditionality. But in my opinion, I feel like there could have been more, for example, regional surveillance. But the problem to this is the fact that ASEAN is a consensus mandate, right? So it's really hard if you want to build like a regional surveillance body. And then another thing is, from what I know, I'm not sure if I'm correct or not, but IMF conditionalities, they tend to be very much of a one size fits all. In a sense, like it's too general. So if we were to put that more of the CMIM's credibility on more autonomy, they might have to create more tailored conditionalities to the particular country in the face of the crisis, or even maybe like strengthening regional cooperation. So I want to know perhaps like, possible, solutions to this, or even the problems that I mentioned, the ASEAN consensus part. Yeah.
So that's a bunch of really interesting questions and good questions. So I'm not sure I'm going to do them in the order that you gave them, but let me try to do them and tell me if I missed one. So first off, ever since this thing was created, there's been a debate over whether this is meant to whether this is going to fully separate from the IMF or not. I don't want to like over reference myself. I'm one of like 5 people who writes on this in English. So I was either right or wrong all the way along, and I've been tracking it since early on. So I end up showing up in all these debates. So forgive me if I say that, but so I was against I've been arguing against the notion that that this is just going straight towards an Asian monetary fund for a number of years. But because that's not beneficial to Japan and China, which are the creditors, right? What they really want is they want not to be blamed if something goes wrong. They want to make sure they get their money back, and they want to put in whatever money is needed, but just get it done. But what they also want is you want to have more leverage versus the IMF. And this one goes back to, this was an argument that was made quite early, which is that by creating a potential alternative, that you don't get the cookie cutter approach, right? That you don't get the 130 conditions down to like how you're doing timber contracts. You know, not that Indonesia shouldn't do its timber contracts properly, but like that's a dumb condition if you're talking about IMF. And it really was one of the 130 conditions in the 1998 agreement. Okay, so the creation of a credible alternative fits with both possibilities. One is aspirations to have a truly regional organization. The other is aspirations to have a credible threat against the IMF. And over time, what we've ended up with is actually a pretty cooperative relationship between AMRO and the IMF. So, and the IMF has sort of arced towards a less punitive approach than it had in the past. So that's answer one. Okay, and I think that was an important. So then the next question is, can AMRO be credibly autonomous? You know, given that ASEAN doesn't want it to, right? Or ASEAN countries aren't going to want it to. And that was something that I was extremely skeptical of for a long time. I kept saying, yeah, this is not going to work. This is not going to work. So what AMRO has done so far has been, I don't want to say they've proved me wrong. They've made me doubt myself. So over how many years? 10 years, but they've been publishing the reports for 7 years. So for the period that AMRO has been in existence, they've been carrying out regularized, standardized procedures, high quality reports. You can look at the reports. They publish them like literally so that we can trust them more. So this is the point I was making at the beginning about institutionalization. I kind of skated over it, but it's a very important one. So they've proved themselves to be quite credible in their surveillance reporting, and also maybe not the equal of the IMF in terms of the ability to write conditions and plans, but to have a more equal relationship. And so what you've seen is the development of actually a pretty cooperative relationship. And between that and that notion that I mentioned at the beginning of the leverage, the potential leverage, is, you know, I at this point believe that if you ended up with a crisis, that that AMRO would ensure that conditions were tailored to the countries involved. Whether that would be what you would agree with or what I would agree with is you know, that's a different question. But that, like, if there were a big difference between AMRO's assessment and the IMF assessment, that it would draw somewhere in the middle. And so that you wouldn't get the cookie cutter. And like we've all seen versions of this. I had a Japanese reporter friend who had been in Korea for a long time, and he said that one of his friends who'd been he was always a little vague about whether he was the finance minister or the deputy finance minister, said that they had been given like a draft of the IMF thing with Indonesia crossed out at the top. I don't know. You know, obviously they were very different plans in a lot of ways, but yeah, the cookie cutter approach is certainly well known. There was a push for austerity, there was a push for privatization, and all of those things raise interest rates, all of those standard pieces. So there has been, as I said, there's been some shift away from that at the IMF. There's been more flexibility in terms of facilities. So depending on the facility that you qualify for, you have more or fewer conditions. And then you also have that AMRO negotiation, that cooperative relationship. So I think it's a little bit better than what I had expected when I first started writing about this, and maybe I hope it's a little bit reassuring to you as well.
Thank you for the presentation. So I'm not sure whether it's right, like depth in question for it, but I just have this like fundamental question that I'm also questioning myself, like this kind of initiative CMIM, this kind of like economic interdependence among the states, among the countries, especially in the Asian region, would it be like increase the likelihood of the security conflict among the states, or would it be helpful to decrease it, in your opinion?
I don't know. I mean, I think that it will not have an effect either direction. But I think that the security dilemma makes it less certain that this will work. Right? Rising tensions between China and Japan, China and potentially other countries, the possibility of, divisions happening within ASEAN based on, choosing sides between China and U.S., Japan, whatever, that all of those things they reduce the certainty that these things will operate as they're supposed to operate economically, right? And they also increase the likelihood that a country that gets in trouble may try to avoid going to the IMF and instead try to play Japan and China off against each other and get and act bilaterally, right? Which may or may not end up being a bad thing or a good thing, but it certainly increases it increases uncertainty, and it shows the challenges of the regime complex. So, I mean, what the regime complex basically shows us is this web, has holes in it, right? And those are the ways in which countries are going to respond to it is going to relate to their own interests and the weaknesses that they see either in the organizations or in individual country responses. And so all of it from my perspective, all of it adds uncertainty and the possibility of sort of security driving a decision. And I think that if I were the Philippines, that I would be less confident that China would be willing to bail me out through providing, how much would they be providing? About $6.5 billion in dollars, given that what's been going on in the South China Sea. I'm not saying that it would or wouldn't, but I am saying that that the security dilemma reduces the likelihood that this will actually work. And essentially, so most of the people who do this are economists who deal with this. They're economists and officials, economic officials, and their objective is to build something that'll work. And so they find me a little bit annoying every once in a while, but it's important to note that all of the institutional guarantees that are put in can be overridden. And we see this all the time with things that we think are institutions that lock action into place. So there was, if you look at China scholars, right, they understood there was an absolute agreement that the factions would be balanced, and you don't have the secretaryship of more than 10 years. Okay, that one doesn't exist. Like in the United States, it never occurred to us that there wouldn't be a peaceful transfer of power. And the last president, tried to stay in place, right? And summons, I don't want to say summons a mob because I'm being recorded, but doesn't stop a mob until he's really forced to, from trying to prevent the vote to go through, and is carrying out all these extra legal mechanisms. So there's a lot of things that we think are constrained by institutions that are actually constrained more by the choices and balances in power. And so the rise in tensions also raises the question about whether these things will work. And even though I was very reassuring to your question about AMRO working well and being effective, that doesn't have to hold, right? That could change. And so, yeah, I don't want to be too pessimistic. But cooperation in tense times is hard. And less tension makes for more probability that it'll work out as it should. But this is a place where China and Japan have the same economic interests. And so that's the best guarantee that we have that things will probably work out.
So given that we've talked about security, we've talked about how how the CMIM works. I'm just curious to ask, let's say all these ASEAN countries end up developing quicker than we've thought they would and have begun contributing more and more to the CMIM. Would the power dynamics change later on? Do you see any predictions of the future based on this, or?
So, okay, interesting factoid. Like that's a nice question, but I'm gonna throw an interesting factoid at you, which prevents that from happening, which is that the Chiang Mai Initiative multilateralization is a treaty ratified in all of those places. So you can't actually change the proportions. You can change the numbers, but you can't change the proportions. You can't change the voting shares. And so, yeah, that's my answer, right? That's also my answer for, wait, isn't the Chinese economy bigger than the Japanese economy? Why is Japan putting in exactly the same amount as China? And how is it that Korea ends up with 16%? Like, how the hell did that happen? And the answer is they negotiated it well, and now it's a treaty. And so something that, and it looked more like these numbers back in 2008 to 2010 when they were negotiating it. But yeah, that's the deal. That is the answer.
All right, thank you very much.
Australia and New Zealand kind of seems to be in close proximity to the ASEAN region. So I was wondering if they have kind of a sort of interest of participating in this common wealth.
So I don't know. I don't know whether there's been serious debate about that in Australia and New Zealand. I know that it's been one of these things that people bring up every once in a while when they say, could this look different? My guess is that it's not particularly attractive to the ASEANs because they don't really want to have their voting power further diluted. And of course, as I just answered to the previous question, it is a treaty. So that might lead to renegotiation of shares. But I'm not aware of serious discussion about that. But I mean, right, in theory, it could happen. In principle, there's no reason not to.
So I know this is not, I have two questions, and I know this is not the main point you have discussed, but since you have touched upon it, so I want to ask, how do you know if the treaty is effective? And the second one is, what are the potential implications of this cooperation to the internationalization of the Chinese RMB?
Okay. So the first is there's no way of knowing whether it'll be effective, right? And so from a personal perspective, I will say that I've had people say, like, why do you even study this? It's never been used. It's obviously meaningless. To which I say, I don't know, $240 billion they've got of this organization. But there's no way of knowing for sure, whether and how it will work. And hopefully you never have to use it. It's like, it's always better not to use this. Okay. So, but I don't have a better answer for you than that. I mean, I think that they've been doing everything possible to try to institutionalize surveillance, the operation of the thing, how you would decide conditionality, how you would cooperate with the IMF in the event of a crisis, et cetera. So, and also trying to expand the number of facilities available and make them more useful. And that's one of the reasons why I was told that the rapid financing facility was put in place, was like Maybe if we say that it's about earthquakes and tsunamis and there's no IMF link, then maybe people will borrow. And maybe we'll sort of break the stigma. Maybe, and also it can be useful, right? Like you get a big tsunami, like it would be nice to have the money. Okay, so the second question is about internationalization of the renminbi, which is a very interesting question. I identified at the beginning that Chiang Mai Initiative multilateralization is about providing dollars to countries that need dollars. In 2021, it was agreed by the ASEAN+3 finance ministers that if a borrowing country wanted to borrow in local currency instead of dollars, they could so request it. This was a Chinese initiative. Okay. I understand that I've heard you were saying that the Koreans were in favor of it as well, but it was, without going into who I talked to or when, I'm extremely confident that this was a Chinese initiative. Okay, so and the idea is that more international use of the renminbi or other currencies could be, could dethrone the dollar to some extent. So the real, maybe, but it would be a really long-term question, right? So right now, let's play the game. So I'm Indonesia, and virtually all of my external borrowing is in dollars, except for the small amount of external borrowing that's in yen. And now I need to start paying back my debts, okay? Do I ask China for renminbi? No, I don't, right? I wouldn't. What would be the circumstances under which I would ask China for renminbi is if I wanted to maintain trade agreement with China, right? Like I can absolutely see activating that bilateral swap before Chiang Mai, but once I'm at the point where I have like an actual financial crisis, what I need is the currency that will pay back the obligations that I owe. And that currency is, for the moment, dollars. We came up with a figure for this for Indonesia. Indonesia actually has the best figures available for it, but the external debt in renminbi is tiny. I forget whether it was 1% or 2% or less than that. It was extremely small, and the U.S. dollar is like 90%, and yeah. It's so in theory, it could be used. I think that practically speaking, it would not be used as much by it's more likely that that another Southeast Asian country would request to, pay in their currency, so that if they were worried about contagion. And China may request to do it as well, but I don't think that it has much of an impact on internationalization of the renminbi, but internationalization of the renminbi would have a big impact on that piece. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of these relationships where like the causality is could go both ways potentially, but I would say that it goes in that direction.
Just about in time and the seminar. And if you guys have no more questions, I think that's it. And let's give Mr. Grimes another round of applause for here. And that was a very active discussion session. So that
was great.
That was really great.
A lot of questions.
So that's it. And thanks for coming by. I know it's final exam week in 1 week, so it's a busy week for all of you. But I'm sure this would have been very useful for my exams that I give out
If
to
you
you
write
guys.
this on your exam, the professor will know that you didn't use ChatGPT.
Oh yeah, I'll know. Exactly. Okay, so excellent. Thank you. See you guys.
Yeah.